Dr. Zethkari stood before the massive viewing screen in the Galactic Council chambers and felt something he had not experienced in over 2 centuries of life. The feeling was strange and uncomfortable, like a cold metal object pressing against his chest. The beings around him spoke in hushed tones about the newest species to join their ancient alliance. Humans, they called them, a young race from a small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. The Valthari scholar adjusted his ceremonial robes and tried to focus on the data streams flowing across his neural implants. His species had ruled the stars for 10,000 years through careful study and precise planning. They understood warfare better than any other race in the galaxy. Their military academies produced the finest strategic minds, and their fleets had never known defeat. Yet 3 times in the past decade, human forces had achieved what seemed impossible. First, the Krillian horde had invaded human space with overwhelming numbers. The insectoid warriors had conquered dozens of systems before humanity even knew they existed. Military analysts across the galaxy predicted human extinction within months. Instead, human forces not only survived but completely destroyed the horde's ability to wage war. The survivors fled to the Outer Rim and had not been seen since. Next came the Nathari Empire, ancient masters of void warfare who had perfected the art of ship-to-ship combat over millennia. Their crystalline vessels could phase through normal matter and strike without warning. Human ships were crude metal constructs that should have been helpless against such advanced technology. Yet within 2 years, the Nathari surrendered unconditionally and requested protection from human retaliation. The third invasion had been the most shocking of all. The Zephyrian Collective, a machine intelligence that had absorbed 17 different species, considered biological life forms primitive and inefficient. Their assault on human colonies began with the complete sterilization of 3 star systems. The galaxy prepared to mourn another extinct species. Instead, the humans somehow turned the machines against themselves, causing the entire collective to shut down permanently. Council Speaker Veltan, an ancient being whose species had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, gestured toward Zethkari with one of his 4 arms. His voice carried the weight of eons when he spoke. Dr. Zethkari, your expertise in xenosociology and military analysis makes you the ideal candidate for this assignment. We must understand how this species achieves such outcomes. Their methods defy everything we know about warfare and civilization. Zethkari bowed his head respectfully. Honored Speaker, I have reviewed the available data. Human technology is primitive by our standards. Their ships lack proper shielding. Their weapons are kinetic rather than energy-based, and their armor appears to be simple metal alloys. By all calculations, they should have been extinct years ago. Precisely why we need you to study them directly, Veltan replied. You will travel to human space and observe their military operations firsthand. Learn their tactics, study their history, understand their motivations. The Council requires a complete analysis of human warfare capabilities. 3 weeks later, Zethkari found himself aboard a human vessel called the USS Liberty. The ship was everything his preliminary analysis had suggested it would be. The corridors were narrow and cramped, designed for beings much smaller than his species. The walls were bare metal painted in dull colors, nothing like the elegant crystal architectures of advanced civilizations. The air recycling systems made constant humming noises that would have driven most sophisticated species to madness. Captain Jake Morrison greeted him at the airlock. The human was smaller than Zethkari had expected, barely reaching the alien's shoulder. His skin was weathered and marked with small scars, and his eyes held an intensity that made the scholar uncomfortable. When Morrison smiled, Zethkari noticed that human teeth were designed for tearing as well as grinding, suggesting an omnivorous past that included hunting living prey. Welcome aboard, Doctor, Morrison said, extending his hand in the human greeting ritual. I've been ordered to give you complete access to our records and personnel. Whatever you need to complete your study, just ask. As they walked through the ship, Zethkari observed the crew with growing confusion. The humans moved with purpose and efficiency, but their behavior patterns were unlike anything he had studied before. They displayed casual familiarity with weapons that could kill them instantly. They joked about dangerous situations that would terrify most species. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to view violence not as a necessary evil, but as a natural part of existence. Morrison led him to the ship's archive center, A room filled with primitive data storage devices and printed materials. "Here's everything you requested," the captain said. "Complete records of our military history, tactical manuals, personal accounts from veterans, and strategic analyses of our recent conflicts. My crew has orders to answer any questions you might have." Zethkari spent his first day reviewing basic human military structure and was immediately struck by how different it was from other species. Most civilized races organized their forces around logical hierarchies designed to minimize casualties and achieve specific objectives with maximum efficiency. Human military organization seemed designed around different principles entirely. Human soldiers were not just trained to fight. They were trained to continue fighting under conditions that would cause other species to surrender immediately. They prepared for scenarios where command structures collapsed, supply lines were cut, and retreat was impossible. Their training emphasized adaptation and improvisation, rather than following predetermined protocols. The historical records were even more puzzling. Humans had been fighting wars continuously for their entire recorded history. Unlike other species that developed beyond their violent origins, humans seemed to have refined warfare into something approaching an art form. They studied their conflicts obsessively, analyzing every victory and defeat to extract lessons for future application. That evening, Morrison invited Zethkari to dine with the senior staff. The conversation gradually turned to their recent campaign against the Nathari Empire. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hayes, the ship's tactical officer, described the final battle with casual matter-of-factness that chilled the alien scholar. "The Nathari thought their phase technology made them untouchable," she said between bites of synthesized protein. "They could appear anywhere, strike without warning, then disappear before we could respond. Traditional tactics were useless against them. How did you overcome such an advantage?" Zethkari asked, genuinely curious. Hayes smiled the same unsettling smile he had seen on Morrison's face. "We stopped trying to fight their ships and started fighting their crews. Turns out even advanced aliens have psychological breaking points. We made their advantage into a disadvantage by making every phase jump a potential trap." Zethkari processed this information with growing unease. Other species develop new technologies or strategies to overcome superior opponents. Humans seem to approach warfare from a completely different angle, focusing on the beings inside the machines rather than the machines themselves. It was the approach that no other military academy in the galaxy taught or even considered viable. As the evening progressed, he began to realize that his assignment would be far more challenging than he had anticipated. These humans operated according to principles that his sophisticated analytical mind struggled to categorize. They had somehow turned warfare into something that existed beyond normal tactical and strategic frameworks. The cold feeling in his chest grew stronger as he retired to his quarters that night. And for the first time in his long career, Dr. Zethkari wondered if there were some things that even advanced civilizations were not meant to understand. Zethkari woke on his third day aboard the USS Liberty, with his neural implants buzzing from information overload. He had spent the previous evening reviewing human combat footage from the Krillian War, and the images continued to disturb his normally rational thought processes. The recordings showed human soldiers fighting in conditions that should have broken any civilized military force within hours. Yet they had continued for months. Captain Morrison found him in the archive center, surrounded by data tablets and looking visibly shaken. "Having trouble processing the information, Doctor?" Morrison asked, settling into the chair across from him. "I am beginning to understand why the Council considers your species so difficult to analyze," Zethkari replied carefully. "Your combat records show engagement patterns that contradict established military theory. At the Battle of Kepler Station, your forces were outnumbered 50-1 by Krillian warriors, yet you held the position for 6 months." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "That was Marine Sergeant Lisa Hayes' unit. She's actually aboard this ship right now, serving as our security chief. Would you like to speak with her directly?" An hour later, Zethkari found himself in the ship's security office facing a human female who could not have stood much taller than his waist. Lisa Hayes was compact and muscular, with scars across her hands and arms that spoke of close combat experience. Her eyes held the same disturbing intensity he had noticed in other humans. But there was something else there as well, something that made his advanced mind recoil instinctively. "The doctor wants to know about Kepler Station," Morrison explained. Hayes leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried no emotion whatsoever. The Krillians hit us during a shift change. Most of our heavy weapons were offline for maintenance and half the garrison was off duty. By standard tactical analysis, we should have evacuated immediately. Why did you not follow standard protocols? Zethkari asked. Because evacuation meant abandoning 3 million civilians on the planet below. Hayes replied. The Krillians don't take prisoners. They consume everything organic on worlds they conquer. Every day we held that station meant more time for civilian transports to escape. Zethkari checked his data records. According to my information, you had sufficient ships to evacuate all personnel and civilians within 72 hours. Hayes smiled, and the expression made the alien scholar's skin crawl. That assumes the Krillians would have given us 72 hours. They were already moving siege equipment into position. We had maybe 6 hours before they could crack the station's shields. So you chose to fight an impossible battle instead? We chose to make it impossible for them to win quickly, Hayes corrected. Every Krillian we killed on that station was one less to hunt down civilian transports. Every day we held them was a day their main fleet couldn't advance into human space. We turned a tactical defeat into a strategic victory. Zethkari processed this information with growing confusion. Military doctrine across the galaxy emphasized preserving forces for future engagements. Sacrificing units for temporary gains was considered primitive and wasteful. Yet Hayes spoke about her unit's destruction as if it had been a calculated decision rather than a desperate last stand. How many of your soldiers survived the siege? He asked. 17 out of 3,000, Hayes replied without emotion. Including me, obviously. The rest died making sure the Krillians paid the maximum price for every meter of station they took. That afternoon, Morrison arranged for Zethkari to interview Commander Ryan Bell, a fighter pilot who had served during the Void War against the Nathari Empire. Bell was younger than Hayes, but his eyes held the same unsettling quality that seemed common among human military personnel. The Nathari had us outclassed in every category, Bell explained as they sat in the ship's pilot briefing room. Their fighters could phase through normal matter so our weapons couldn't touch them. They could appear inside our formations, destroy several ships, and disappear before we could react. How did human pilots overcome such a technological disadvantage? Zethkari asked. Bell grinned, and the alien scholar noticed again how human facial expressions involving bared teeth suggested aggression rather than friendliness. We stopped trying to fight their technology and started fighting their psychology. See, the Nathari are an ancient species. They've been using the same tactics for thousands of years because those tactics always worked. And you exploited this predictability? We exploited their inability to adapt when someone stopped following the rules, Bell corrected. Nathari pilots expected us to react defensively when they appeared in our formations. Instead, we started using ramming attacks. Their ships might be able to phase through matter, but they have to solidify to fire weapons. We timed our collisions to those moments. Zethkari felt his translator struggling with the concept. You deliberately crashed your vessels into enemy ships? When necessary, Bell replied matter-of-factly. A human pilot and fighter costs maybe 1 million credits to replace. A Nathari phase ship represents centuries of construction and contains irreplaceable technology. From a pure resource standpoint, we could afford to trade 100 of our ships for each of theirs. But that meant certain death for your pilots. Bell shrugged. Death was already certain if we fought conventionally. At least this way our deaths accomplished something useful. After we destroyed their first squadron with kamikaze attacks, the Nathari started hesitating before engaging. That hesitation gave our surviving pilots the opening they needed to develop more sophisticated tactics. The conversation continued for another hour, but Zethkari found himself struggling to focus on the technical details. His advanced analytical mind kept returning to a disturbing realization. Human military thinking operated on principles that his species had eliminated from their psychology millions of years ago. They not only accepted death as a possible outcome of conflict, they actively incorporated the possibility into their strategic planning. That evening, Dr. Amanda Foster joined him for dinner in the officers' mess. Foster was a human military historian who had been assigned to help with his research. Unlike the combat veterans he had interviewed, she seemed more scholarly and analytical. Yet even she displayed the same casual familiarity with violence that characterized all humans. "What troubles you most about human warfare, Doctor?" Foster asked as they ate. "Your species treats individual survival as secondary to mission objectives," Sethkari replied carefully. Most civilized races prioritize preserving life above achieving tactical goals. Foster considered this while cutting her synthetic meat with movements that reminded him uncomfortably of predatory feeding behaviors. I think you're misunderstanding our priorities. We don't treat individual survival as unimportant. We treat mission failure as unacceptable. Is there a difference? Absolutely, Foster said. When Sergeant Hayes held Kepler Station, she wasn't choosing to die. She was choosing to make her death count for something. When Commander Bell rammed Nathari ships, he wasn't committing suicide. He was investing his life in the most effective way possible. Sethkari set down his eating utensil, no longer hungry. You speak of death as if it were a resource to be allocated efficiently. In warfare, everything is a resource to be allocated efficiently, Foster replied. Time, ammunition, equipment, personnel, terrain, information. The difference between humans and other species is that we include our own lives in that calculation. Most aliens try to win while minimizing casualties. We try to win regardless of casualties. As the evening progressed, Foster showed him historical records from human conflicts that predated their entry into galactic civilization. The data painted a picture of a species that had been refining the art of warfare for millennia. Unlike other races that developed beyond their violent origins, humans had transformed violence into something approaching a science. Every human conflict teaches us something new about the nature of war, Foster explained. We study our defeats as carefully as our victories because both contain lessons that might prove useful in future conflicts. Other species fight to achieve immediate objectives. We fight to become better at fighting. That night, Sethkari lay in his quarters staring at the ceiling and trying to process what he had learned. His neural implants continued analyzing the data, searching for patterns and logical frameworks that could explain human military success. But the more he studied their methods, the more convinced he became that human warfare operated according to principles that existed outside normal rational analysis. The cold feeling in his chest had grown stronger, and he was beginning to recognize it for what it was. Fear. Not the simple fear of physical harm, but something deeper and more disturbing. The fear of encountering something that his advanced mind could not categorize or understand. For the first time since beginning his assignment, Sethkari wondered if the Galactic Council had made a mistake in trying to analyze humanity. Some things, he was beginning to suspect, were not meant to be understood by civilized minds. Captain Morrison informed Sethkari over breakfast that they would be making a detour to Mars for military exercises. The scholar had been aboard the USS Liberty for a week now, and his daily reports to the Galactic Council were becoming increasingly difficult to write. How could he explain in rational terms what he was witnessing? Human warfare defied every principle of civilized conflict that his species had developed over millennia of study. The Red Planet came into view 3 days later, and Sethkari observed the human military installation through the ship's observation deck. The base sprawled across hundreds of square kilometers of Martian surface, with training facilities that seemed designed to simulate the most hostile environments imaginable. Morrison joined him at the viewing port, pointing out various structures with obvious pride. This is where we train our special forces, Morrison explained. The conditions here are perfect for preparing soldiers to fight in environments where normal life support systems fail. Low gravity, thin atmosphere, extreme temperatures. If you can fight effectively on Mars, you can fight effectively anywhere. Sethkari studied the base through his enhanced vision. Other species train their forces in controlled environments that minimize risk to personnel. Your facilities appear designed to maximize danger. Danger in training saves lives in combat, Morrison replied. We'd rather lose a few soldiers during preparation than lose entire units during actual warfare. Pain is a better teacher than theory. They shuttled down to the base the following morning, and Sethkari found himself in a briefing room filled with human military instructors. The beings around him carried themselves with the same unsettling confidence he had noticed in other human soldiers. But there was something additional here. These humans had the look of predators who had spent their entire lives studying how to kill more efficiently. Colonel Susan Wright, the base commander, welcomed them with the ritual human smile that continued to disturb the alien scholar. She was older than the other humans he had met, with gray hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent making difficult decisions. Dr. Sethkari, we've prepared a demonstration of our training methods for your study, Wright said. Private Danny Rodriguez will be conducting a combat simulation that should illustrate how we prepare our forces for asymmetric warfare. They move to an observation deck overlooking a massive chamber filled with holographic projectors and physical obstacles. Below them, a single human soldier stood waiting for the exercise to begin. Rodriguez appeared young even by human standards, barely old enough to serve in any civilized military. Yet his posture and movement suggested a level of training that most species reserved for elite specialists. The scenario is simple, Wright explained as technicians activated the simulation. Private Rodriguez faces a virtual enemy force of 100 hostile units equipped with superior weapons and technology. His objective is survival for 30 minutes. Most species would consider this an impossible scenario designed for failure analysis. The simulation began, and Zethakari watched through his enhanced vision as holographic enemies materialized throughout the chamber. The opposition force moved with mechanical precision, employing tactics that his own military analysts would consider optimal for the terrain and objectives. Rodriguez should have been overwhelmed within minutes. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The young human began moving in patterns that defied conventional tactical analysis. He used the environment in ways that no military manual would suggest, turning obstacles into weapons and creating advantages where none should have existed. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they occurred. How is he predicting their positions? Zethakari asked as Rodriguez eliminated his 20th opponent without taking significant damage. He's not predicting anything, Wright replied. He's thinking like they think. Human soldiers learn to understand their enemies so completely that they can anticipate decisions before those decisions are made. We call it tactical empathy. Zethakari processed this concept with growing unease. His species developed sophisticated computer models to predict enemy behavior based on known tactical doctrines and logical decision trees. Humans seem to accomplish the same result through some form of intuitive understanding that bypassed rational analysis entirely. The simulation continued, and Rodriguez's performance became increasingly impossible to explain through conventional military theory. He began using his own equipment in ways that violated operational protocols, transforming defensive tools into offensive weapons and creating tactical opportunities where none had existed moments before. Your soldier is not following established combat procedures, Zethakari observed. Exactly, Wright said with obvious satisfaction. Following established procedures makes you predictable. Predictable forces lose battles against unpredictable opponents. We train our soldiers to think beyond doctrine, to become something that no enemy manual can account for. When the 30-minute exercise ended, Rodriguez had not only survived, but had eliminated 73 of the 100 virtual enemies. His success rate far exceeded what any advanced computer model would have calculated as possible. Wright led them down to the training floor to speak with the soldier directly. Rodriguez was breathing heavily but showed no signs of serious fatigue. When Wright introduced Zethakari, the young human displayed the same unsettling confidence that characterized his species. His eyes held an intensity that made the alien scholar uncomfortable, as if Rodriguez was already analyzing him as a potential threat. Private, can you explain your tactical approach during the simulation? Wright asked. Rodriguez considered the question seriously before answering. I stopped trying to fight their plan and started making them fight my chaos. Every time they adapted to my actions, I changed what those actions meant. Eventually, they were responding to threats that no longer existed while ignoring the real dangers. Zethakari struggled to translate this explanation into concepts his analytical mind could process. You deliberately created confusion in your own tactical approach? I created uncertainty in their tactical approach, Rodriguez corrected. Confusion is when you don't know what's happening. Uncertainty is when you can't predict what will happen next. I turned their strength into weakness by making their superior numbers work against their coordination. That afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Susan Wright took Zethakari on a tour of the base's historical archive. The facility contained records of human military conflicts dating back thousands of years, from primitive tribal warfare to their recent galactic engagements. Wright seemed genuinely enthusiastic about sharing her knowledge of human military evolution. Most species develop beyond their violent origins, Wright explained as they walked between rows of data storage units. They learned to resolve conflicts through negotiation, economic pressure, or technological superiority. Humans took a different path. We perfected violence until it became something approaching an art form. She showed him records of ancient human conflicts that demonstrated the same disturbing patterns he had observed in their modern warfare. Even with primitive weapons and limited communication, human forces had consistently achieved victories against superior opponents through methods that defied rational analysis. The Battle of Thermopylae, Wright said, activating a holographic display. 300 Spartan warriors held off an army of hundreds of thousands for 3 days. Logically impossible, yet historically documented. The Battle of Rorke's Drift, where 150 British soldiers defeated 4,000 Zulu warriors. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where civilians with improvised weapons fought trained military forces for months. Zethkari studied the historical data with growing alarm. These conflicts share common elements that contradict established military principles. In each case, the human forces were facing certain defeat, yet they continued fighting beyond any logical breaking point. "Now you're beginning to understand," Wright said with a smile that chilled him to his core. "We don't fight to win. We fight to make sure our enemies lose everything, including the will to fight anyone else ever again. Victory is temporary. The psychological impact of fighting humans is permanent." As they continued through the archive, Wright showed him analysis of the 3 recent galactic conflicts that had brought humanity to the Council's attention. The data revealed something that his initial reports had missed entirely. The Krillian Horde, Nethari Empire, and Zephyrian Collective had not simply been defeated. They had been transformed by their encounters with human warfare. The Krillians were a warrior culture that had conquered dozens of systems through pure aggression, Wright explained. After fighting us, the survivors withdrew to the Outer Rim and have shown no interest in expansion. The Nethari were master tacticians who had perfected void warfare over millennia. They now refused to engage in any military action whatsoever. The Zephyrian Collective was a machine intelligence that considered biological life inefficient. They shut down permanently rather than risk another encounter with human forces. Zethkari felt his neural implants struggling to process the implications. You did not simply defeat these species. You altered their fundamental relationship with conflict itself. Zethkari had been aboard the USS Liberty for 2 weeks when Captain Morrison approached him with an unusual expression. The human's face showed signs of internal conflict, as if he were struggling with a difficult decision. During their time together, the alien scholar had learned to read basic human emotional displays, and this particular combination of facial tension suggested Morrison was about to reveal something significant. "Doctor, I've received authorization from Fleet Command to show you classified material," Morrison said quietly. "Admiral Kevin Brooks wants to meet with you personally. He believes your study requires access to information that goes beyond our standard military records." 3 days later, they docked at Luna Station, humanity's primary military command center orbiting Earth's moon. The facility was massive beyond anything Zethkari had expected, with defensive installations that rivaled the best fortifications he had seen anywhere in the galaxy. As their shuttle approached the docking bay, he observed weapon systems that his trained eye could not immediately identify or categorize. Admiral Brooks met them at the airlock, and Zethkari immediately recognized that this human was different from the others he had encountered. Brooks carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had made decisions that affected the survival of entire species. His eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge too dangerous for most minds to contain. "Dr. Zethkari," Brooks said, extending his hand in the human greeting ritual. "I understand you've been studying our military capabilities for the Galactic Council. I'm here to show you why that might not be the wise course of action your council believes it to be." They walked through corridors lined with memorial walls containing thousands of names. Brooks explained that these were human soldiers who had died in conflicts that the galaxy knew nothing about. The numbers were staggering, representing casualties from battles that had never appeared in any official reports. "The 3 invasions that brought us to galactic attention were not our greatest military challenges," Brooks said as they entered a secure briefing room. "They were training exercises that got out of hand. Our real wars happened before we left our home system, and those conflicts would have destroyed most civilized species completely." Zethkari felt his neural implants struggling to process this information. "You are suggesting that humanity fought more devastating conflicts than the galactic invasions?" "I'm not suggesting it, Doctor. I'm stating it as documented fact, Brooks replied, activating a holographic display. For the past 5,000 years, humanity has been engaged in continuous military evolution. Every generation produced conflicts that pushed our understanding of warfare beyond previous limits. The display showed human conflicts that Zethkari had not seen in any of his previous research. World wars that killed hundreds of millions, civil conflicts that lasted for decades, proxy wars fought across multiple continents simultaneously. The scale of destruction was beyond anything his species had experienced during their entire recorded history. Why did your species not destroy itself through such sustained violence? Zethkari asked. Brooks smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any he had seen during his entire study. Because we learned to use war as an evolutionary pressure. Every conflict taught us something new about survival, adaptation, and the application of force. We didn't fight to destroy ourselves. We fought to become something that could not be destroyed. Intelligence Officer Captain Nicole Price joined them, carrying data storage devices that required special authorization to access. Price was younger than Brooks, but carried herself with the same unsettling confidence that characterized all senior human military personnel. When she spoke, her voice held absolute certainty about facts that should have been impossible. Doctor, what I'm about to show you is classified at levels that most of our own species are not authorized to know, Price said. The information concerns humanity's actual military capacity and our long-term strategic objectives. The data she presented challenged everything Zethkari thought he understood about human civilization. Earth's surface contained military installations that could destroy entire fleets. Hidden factories produced weapon systems that incorporated technologies beyond current galactic understanding. Most disturbing of all, humanity had been preparing for galactic warfare since before they achieved faster-than-light travel. You began developing anti-alien military doctrine before making contact with other species? Zethkari asked, his translator struggling with the concept. We began developing anti-alien military doctrine the moment we realized other species might exist, Price corrected. Human strategic planning operates on timescales that most civilizations cannot comprehend. We don't prepare for conflicts that might happen next year. We prepare for conflicts that might happen next century. Brooks activated another display showing human fleet deployments throughout their territorial space. The numbers were staggering. Humanity possessed military forces 10 times larger than what they had reported to the Galactic Council. Their technology, while appearing primitive, incorporated design principles that made their ships nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means. The vessels that fought the Krillians, Nithari and Zephyrians represented approximately 3% of our actual military capacity, Brooks explained. We use those conflicts to test new tactical doctrines and evaluate alien response patterns. The invasions were not threats to our survival. They were opportunities for practical military research. Zethkari felt something approaching panic as he processed this information. You deliberately allowed alien forces to attack your colonies in order to study their capabilities. We deliberately created conditions that would encourage alien forces to reveal their full military potential, Price clarified. The colonies they attacked were evacuated weeks before the invasions began. The casualties were volunteers who understood that their sacrifice would provide crucial intelligence about alien warfare methods. The briefing continued for hours, and each new revelation was more disturbing than the last. Humanity had been manipulating galactic politics since their first contact with alien species. Their admission to the Galactic Council had been carefully orchestrated to provide them with access to advanced alien technologies and strategic intelligence. Most terrifying of all, they had been preparing for a conflict that would determine the ultimate direction of galactic civilization. What is your species' ultimate objective? Zethkari asked, though he was beginning to fear the answer. Brooks considered the question carefully before responding. Humanity's ultimate objective is to ensure that no species in this galaxy ever develops the capacity to threaten human survival. We don't seek to conquer other civilizations. We seek to make the concept of threatening humanity unthinkable. Through military force? Through superior understanding of what military force actually represents, Brooks corrected. Other species view warfare as a tool for achieving political objectives. Humans view warfare as a fundamental force of nature that can be harnessed but never eliminated. We don't fight wars, Doctor. We conduct evolutionary processes that use conflict as a catalyst for advancement. As the briefing concluded, Price showed him intelligence reports on every major species in the galaxy. The level of detail was extraordinary, revealing that humanity had been studying alien military capabilities, psychological profiles, and strategic weaknesses for decades. They knew more about galactic civilization than the Galactic Council knew about itself. The Council believes that humanity is a young species that achieved unexpected victories through luck and determination, Brooks said as they prepared to leave. That belief serves our strategic interests. The longer other species underestimate our capabilities, the more time we have to complete our preparations. Preparations for what? Seth Kari asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. For the day when the galaxy realizes what we actually are, Brooks replied. When that day comes, every species will have to choose between accepting human leadership or facing the consequences of opposition. We prefer that choice to be easy for them to make. That evening, as Zethkari sat in his quarters aboard the USS Liberty, he tried to process everything he had learned. His assignment from the Galactic Council had been to study human military capabilities and provide recommendations for diplomatic engagement. Instead, he had discovered that humanity was not a species seeking integration into galactic civilization. They were a predator species that had been studying galactic civilization as prey. The reports he had been sending to the Council were woefully inadequate. How could he explain that humanity's true military capability was beyond current understanding? How could he convey that their strategic thinking operated on timescales that made other species' planning look like improvisation? Most importantly, how could he warn the Council that their newest member was not seeking partnership, but domination? As he began composing his next report, Zethkari realized that he faced an impossible choice. If he reported what he had learned, the Council would likely initiate military action against humanity. Such action would fail catastrophically and result in the very conflict that Brooks had described. If he concealed the truth, Dr. Zethkari stood in his private quarters aboard the USS Liberty for what he knew would be the final time. 3 weeks of studying humanity had fundamentally changed his understanding of warfare, civilization, and the nature of intelligent life itself. The reports he had prepared for the Galactic Council lay before him, representing the most important document he had ever created. Yet he knew that no matter how carefully he chose his words, the truth he had discovered would be too dangerous for most minds to accept. Captain Morrison had granted him one final interview before his departure, and the human's demeanor suggested he understood the significance of their conversation. They sat across from each other in Morrison's private office, two beings from different species who had shared knowledge that would forever change the balance of galactic power. "You know what I've learned during my time here?" Zethkari said without preamble. "Your species is not what you pretend to be. The question is whether you will allow me to report the truth to the Council." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than threatening. "Doctor, I want you to understand something that might not be obvious to non-human minds. We've never lied to you or anyone else about what we are. We simply allowed other species to make their own assumptions about our capabilities and motivations. You deliberately concealed your true military strength. We displayed exactly the level of force necessary to achieve our immediate objectives," Morrison corrected. "The Krillians, Nathari, and Zephyrians saw what they needed to see to understand that attacking humanity was not profitable. The Galactic Council saw what they needed to see to accept us as members. You've seen what you needed to see to complete your analysis." Zethkari processed this statement with growing understanding. Each revelation was carefully calculated to produce specific responses in the observers. Every action humanity takes on the galactic stage serves multiple strategic purposes, Morrison confirmed. Your study was not just an opportunity for the Council to learn about us. It was an opportunity for us to learn how the Council would respond to different levels of information about human capabilities. The alien scholar felt his neural implant struggling to categorize the implications. "You've been using my research as a test of galactic reaction patterns." Morrison smiled, and for the first time the expression did not seem predatory. "Doctor, you've spent 3 weeks studying human warfare. In that time you've learned that we approach conflict differently than other species. What you may not have realized is that we approach everything differently than other species, including diplomacy, trade, exploration, and scientific research." "What are you trying to tell me? That humanity's admission to the Galactic Council was not the beginning of our integration into galactic civilization, Morrison replied. It was the beginning of galactic civilization's integration into human strategic planning. The Council believes they accepted us as junior partners. In reality, they agreed to become part of a larger framework that they don't yet understand. Zethkari felt the cold sensation in his chest evolve into something approaching terror as the full scope of human planning became clear. How long have you been manipulating galactic politics? Since our first contact with alien species, Morrison answered matter-of-factly. Human strategic doctrine assumes that any contact between civilizations will eventually result in conflict. We prefer to control the timing and nature of that conflict rather than allowing random events to dictate outcomes. The conversation continued for another hour, but Zethkari found his attention divided between Morrison's words and his own internal struggle with the knowledge he had gained. His species had developed advanced analytical capabilities over millions of years of evolution, yet he was encountering concepts that his sophisticated mind could not adequately process. When their meeting concluded, Morrison walked him to the shuttle bay where transport back to Galactic Council space awaited. As they stood before the airlock, the human captain made one final statement that would haunt the alien scholar for the rest of his life. "Doctor, you asked me earlier why humans seem so comfortable with warfare. I told you that we're not comfortable with war, but we're comfortable with becoming something else when war demands it. What I didn't tell you is that we've been something else for a very long time now. The beings you call humans are what our species became when we realized that the universe is fundamentally hostile to intelligent life." "What do you mean?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "Every species in this galaxy developed intelligence in environments that taught them cooperation was essential for survival. Humans developed intelligence in an environment that taught us competition was essential for survival. We learned to see every other intelligent being as a potential threat that needed to be understood, controlled, or eliminated. That suggests your species is inherently aggressive. It suggests our species is inherently realistic," Morrison corrected. "The universe contains limited resources and unlimited potential for conflict. Most civilizations prefer to ignore this reality until circumstances force them to confront it. Humans prefer to acknowledge reality and plan accordingly." The shuttle journey back to Council space took 4 days, and Zethkari spent the entire time struggling to compose his final report. How could he explain to the Council that their newest member was not seeking partnership, but preparing for eventual dominance? How could he convey that humanity's true military capability was beyond current galactic understanding? Most importantly, how could he warn them that any attempt to confront humanity militarily would result in their complete destruction? When he finally arrived at the Council chambers, Speaker Velton greeted him with obvious anticipation. The ancient being's forearms gestured enthusiastically as he escorted Zethkari to the presentation hall, where the full council awaited his findings. "Doctor, your preliminary reports have been most illuminating," Velton said as they walked. "The council is eager to hear your complete analysis of human military capabilities and your recommendations for future diplomatic engagement." Zethkari took his position before the assembled representatives of dozens of galactic civilizations and felt the weight of knowledge that could determine the fate of every species in the galaxy. His neural implants displayed the carefully prepared presentation that would satisfy the council's expectations while concealing the most dangerous truths he had discovered. "Honored council members," he began, his voice steady despite the internal turmoil. "My study of human warfare has revealed a species that approaches conflict through unconventional methods that often prove surprisingly effective against traditional military doctrine." He spent the next hour presenting data that portrayed humanity as a competent but manageable military force. He described their tactical innovations, their psychological approach to warfare, and their tendency to achieve victories through determination rather than superior technology. Everything he said was technically accurate while completely missing the larger implications of human strategic thinking. When he finished, the council members asked questions that revealed they had interpreted his findings exactly as he had intended. They saw humanity as a useful ally whose military capabilities could supplement galactic defense forces without threatening established power structures. They completely failed to understand that humanity had been preparing for galactic dominance since before achieving interstellar travel. "Thank you, Dr. Zethkari," Speaker Velton said as the session concluded, "Your analysis confirms our initial assessment that humanity can be successfully integrated into galactic civilization. We will proceed with full diplomatic and military cooperation." That evening, alone in his private chambers, Zethkari completed his true report and sealed it in a data storage device that would remain encrypted until his death. Future scholars would eventually learn the truth about humanity, but by then it would be too late for that knowledge to change anything. He had made his choice. Rather than triggering a galactic war that humanity would inevitably win, he had allowed the Council to continue believing they controlled the situation. The alternative would have been mass destruction on a scale that civilized minds could not comprehend. As he prepared for sleep, Zethkari reflected on the final lesson his study had taught him. The most dangerous enemies were not those who threatened you with superior force, but those who convinced you they were not enemies at all. Humanity had achieved galactic dominance without conquest, simply by being something that other species could not recognize as a threat until it was too late to respond effectively. The cold feeling in his chest had finally evolved into something approaching acceptance. He had studied human war and discovered a new kind of fear. Not the fear of being destroyed, but the fear of being absorbed into something larger without ever realizing it was happening. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy through military force. They had conquered it through superior understanding of what conquest actually meant. In the years that followed, Zethkari watched as human influence gradually expanded throughout galactic civilization. Trade agreements that favored human interests, defense treaties that placed human commanders in key positions,